The first time Pearl Doyle saw Abel Bishop, he was standing at the far edge of her property line like a man deciding whether the world owed him anything, and she could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had long since concluded it did not. It was the spring of 1878, deep in the hill country of Texas, where the land rolled out in waves of cedar and limestone, and the sky pressed down so wide and blue it felt almost like a punishment for those who had no roof to hide beneath. Pearl had been living alone on the 40-acre homestead since her husband Thomas had died of a fever the previous November, leaving her with a clapboard house, a decent well, a small kitchen garden, 2 milk cows, and a debt to the Caldwell Mercantile that she was determined to pay off before winter came again. She was 28 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed and sturdy in the way that pioneer women became sturdy, not from wanting to be hard but from having no other choice. She had been carrying a bucket of water from the well to the garden when she first noticed him at the fence post, just standing there with one hand resting on the top rail, and his hat tipped back enough for her to see his face in profile. He was lean and weathered, the kind of lean that came from months on the trail rather than from any natural thinness. His coat was dusty and his boots were cracked at the toe, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had learned not to move unless there was a reason for it. He was not old, she guessed somewhere around 30 or 32, but he carried himself like a man who had lived considerably more than his years. He did not knock on the gate. He did not call out. He simply stood there looking at the far hills with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between exhaustion and resignation, and Pearl set her bucket down on the garden path and watched him for a long moment before she decided what kind of woman she was going to be about it. She was going to be the practical kind. She walked to the fence, her boots crunching on the dry grass, and when she was close enough for him to hear her without her shouting, she said, "Are you lost or are you just resting your eyes on the scenery?" He turned his head slowly, and she saw then that his eyes were a particular shade of gray-green, like creek water in the shade, and they were careful eyes, the kind that had learned to take in everything before committing to an expression. "Neither one, ma'am," he said. "I was told in town there might be a man here willing to pay for some fence mending." Pearl looked at him for a moment without speaking. The town, which was the small community of Harlan's Creek, was 4 miles to the east. People in Harlan's Creek knew her situation well enough to send strangers her way when they were looking for work, though whether they did it out of genuine helpfulness or out of a desire to see how the widow Doyle was managing was a matter she had never quite settled in her mind. "There is no man here," she said. "There's me." He absorbed this information without any visible surprise. "Is there still fence to be mended?" She thought about that for a moment, because the honest answer was yes. The south pasture fence had 3 sections that had gone down in the ice storms of January, and the cows had gotten through twice already in April, causing her the kind of grief that only a woman alone trying to chase 2 dairy cows across limestone scrub at 5 in the morning could fully understand. "There is," she said. "The pay is $1 a day plus meals. The fence work will take 2, maybe 3 days depending on the rock." He nodded slowly like a man considering a business proposition, which was exactly what it was. "I can start now if you want to show me where." "I haven't agreed yet," Pearl said. "No," he said, "you haven't." And something about the quiet steadiness of the way he said it, without any argument or salesmanship or the particularly grating manner some men had of attempting to charm a woman into a decision she was still thinking through, made her decide. "What's your name?" she asked. "Abel Bishop." "Pearl Doyle," she said, and opened the gate. He came in off the road and followed her down the fence line toward the south pasture, and he did not try to fill the silence with unnecessary talk, which she appreciated. She showed him the 3 down sections and pointed out where the stone post anchors had heaved out of the frozen ground, and he crouched down and studied each one without any dramatic sighing about the scale of the problem, which she also appreciated. "I'll need a bar and some wire," he said, "if you've got it. There's wire in the barn and a digging bar hanging on the left side of the door." He nodded, and she left him to it, because she had her own work to do, and because she was not the kind of woman who hovered. By the time she had finished her garden watering and tended to the cows and started a pot of beans on the stove, she could hear the steady clang of the digging bar against limestone coming from the south pasture, a sound that was so ordinary and so welcome in its ordinariness that she found herself standing very still in her kitchen just listening to it for a moment, the way you might stand still to hear something that reminded you of a time when everything was easier. She shook herself and got back to the beans. At noon, she carried lunch out to the south pasture on a tin plate: beans with a piece of salt pork, 2 biscuits, and a cup of water from the well, and she found him on his knees in the dirt with a length of wire twisted around a post anchor, working with the systematic concentration of a man who knew what he was doing. He looked up when he heard her coming. "I'll set it on the post here," she said, meaning she would leave it on the flat top of the nearest standing fence post so he could eat when he was ready, because she had not brought a chair and she was not going to stand there watching him eat. "Thank you," he said. She went back to the house. She did not notice until late afternoon, when she went to collect the tin plate, that he had eaten every bite and then restacked 2 of the stones that had fallen around the post base more neatly than they had been when they were originally set. It was not something she had asked him to do. It was not something that changed the practical function of the fence. He had just done it because doing it properly apparently mattered to him, and Pearl held the empty plate in her hands and looked at the neat stone, stacking for a long moment before walking back to the house. That evening she stepped out onto the porch as the sun was going down to call him in for supper, expecting to find him still working, because the light was only now beginning to fade, and he had struck her as the kind of man who worked until the last possible moment. But he was already coming up from the pasture, the digging bar over one shoulder, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who had done a full day's work, and was under no illusion that he had done more or less than that. "Supper's on," she said. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her, and something passed across his face that she couldn't immediately name, a kind of careful flicker, like a lamp turned very low. "Thank you kindly, ma'am," he said. "I'll eat out here if it's all the same to you." She looked at him for a moment. It was not the kind of thing she had expected him to say. Her supper table was inside, and she had set it for 2, which was the first time she had set it for 2 since Thomas had died, a fact she was not going to examine too closely. "The food will get cold," she said. "It won't bother me," he said, and he said it so simply that she understood it was not a preference born of rudeness or oddness but something else entirely, something that had to do with wherever he had been and whatever had happened to him before he ended up standing at her fence post that morning. She went inside and brought a plate out and set it on the porch rail without comment, and he sat down on the steps and ate while she sat in the porch chair and ate her own supper, and the evening settled in around them with its chorus of crickets and the distant calling of a nightjar, and neither one of them said anything that was not strictly necessary, and yet the quiet between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that 2 careful people can share when neither one of them is trying to prove anything. After he had cleaned the plate, he set it on the bottom step and said, "I'll bed down in the barn if that's acceptable." "That's acceptable," Pearl said. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it beside him on the step, stood, and walked to the barn, and Pearl watched him go and then looked down at her own empty plate and sat with the strange feeling that had settled in her chest, which was not longing, not exactly, but was perhaps the memory of what it felt like to have someone else in the world who was not entirely a stranger. She told herself it was just the strangeness of company after months of silence, and went inside and washed the plates. He was up before she was the next morning. She knew because when she came out to the porch in the gray hour before sunrise with her coffee, she could already hear him out at the well, the squeak of the pump handle carrying clearly through the still morning air. She stood with her coffee and watched the eastern sky go from gray to pink to pale gold, and thought about all the things she had not thought about in a very long time, which was not a useful exercise, and which she stopped doing when she heard him starting on the fence again. He mended the second section that morning and was halfway through the third by the time she brought lunch out at noon, again on a plate set on the fence post, again with a cup of water. This time when she came back to collect the plate an hour later, he was still there, sitting on the ground with his back against a cedar post and the empty plate beside him, and he looked up at her with those gray-green eyes and said, "There's a spring running under this corner of your pasture." Pearl stopped. "Is there? The ground's wet about 6 inches down all along this section. Your fence posts keep heaving because the frost gets into the wet ground. You need to either move this section of the fence back about 15 feet to the dry rock, or you need to drain the low ground before winter comes." She looked at the section of fence he was working on and then looked at the ground and thought about how she had chased the cows across the limestone twice already and how many more times she could expect to do it if nothing changed. "What would draining take?" she said. "A day's worth of digging a channel down to that draw to the west," he said, "if you've got a spade." "I've got a spade. Then I can do it after I finish this section." She looked at him for a long moment. "I agreed to pay for fence mending," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Not for drainage work." "No, ma'am," he said, and he looked at her steadily in that careful way he had that managed to convey nothing in particular while still communicating something, and she understood without either of them saying so that he was offering to do the drainage work as something separate from the contract, not for pay, but simply because the problem was there and he could see how to fix it. "$1.50 a day then," she said, "for the fence and the drainage both." He considered this with what appeared to be genuine deliberateness. "$1.25, he said. "The drainage is not as hard as the fence." Pearl felt a startling and entirely inconvenient desire to smile, which she contained successfully. "$1.25, she agreed, and picked up the plate and went back to the house. That evening she set a plate on the porch rail again without mentioning it, and again he ate on the steps while she sat in the porch chair. And this time the silence had a different quality to it, less guarded, as if they had passed some invisible marker that both of them had recognized without pointing it out. After a while he said, "You've been running this place alone." It was not quite a question. "Since November," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a long winter to come through by yourself." "Yes," she said, "it was." The nightjar called again from somewhere in the cedar thicket to the north, and the stars were coming out clear and brilliant above the dark rim of the hills, and Pearl said, without particularly planning to, "Where have you been before here?" He was quiet for long enough that she wondered if she had overstepped, but then he said, "All over. I worked a cattle drive up from San Antonio to Abilene last fall. Before that I was in New Mexico territory for a while. Before that I was in Colorado." "Were you always a trail hand?" "No," he said. "I had a place once, a little piece of ground up in the hill country north of Fredericksburg." A pause. "I lost it." He said it in the way that people said certain things in that time and that country, matter-of-factly, because loss was so common it barely warranted dramatic language. But Pearl heard what was underneath the matter-of-factness, and she did not push for more. "I'm sorry," she said. "Thank you," he said. After he had gone to the barn, she sat on the porch for a long time in the dark, thinking about a man who had once had a piece of ground he called his own, and had lost it, and had spent the time since then apparently moving from job to job across the length and breadth of the frontier, not eating inside 4 walls, sleeping in barns and under stars, carrying everything he owned on one horse. She thought about what a long and lonely way that was to live, and she thought about how it was possible to become so accustomed to a solitary life that the idea of being inside 4 walls with other people started to feel like something foreign and almost threatening. She understood that feeling better than he probably imagined she did. The drainage work took Abel most of the 3rd day, and it was hard work in the way that digging through limestone-laced hardpan is always hard work, and she brought him water twice during the afternoon, and each time he thanked her and drank deeply and went back to it without complaint. By late afternoon he had cut a clean channel from the wet corner of the pasture down through the lower ground to the draw, and when Pearl came out to look at it, she could already see the water beginning to move through it, a thin clear thread running out to where it disappeared into the brush. "That'll need another pass after the first real rain," he said, "to clear the silt, but the worst of it is done." "I can manage that part," Pearl said. He nodded and shouldered the spade, and they walked back toward the barn together. And for a few steps they were walking close enough that their arms nearly touched, and neither of them moved away, and neither of them acknowledged it. That evening Pearl made something more than beans. She had killed one of her extra hens that afternoon. There was nothing extraordinary about this decision, she told herself. She had been meaning to do it for a week, and she had roasted it with a handful of the dried sage she kept in a clay pot on the kitchen shelf, and made a gravy from the pan drippings, and boiled some of the early potatoes from the garden. She set 2 plates on the kitchen table and then looked at them for a moment, and then she thought of the way he had said, "I'll eat out here if it's all the same to you." And she carried 1 plate out to the porch rail and went back inside to eat her own supper at the table alone. She heard him come up the porch steps. She heard the brief quiet of him seeing the plate, and then the creak of him sitting down on the steps. She ate her supper and listened to the crickets and the soft sound of the horses in the barn, and she felt the strangest, most particular kind of warmth that was not quite loneliness and not quite happiness, but was somewhere in the country between them, a place she had not been in a long time. When she went out to collect the plate, he was still sitting on the steps, his long legs stretched out before him, looking at the stars. He looked up when she came through the door and said, "That was a fine meal, Mrs. Doyle." "Pearl," she said before she quite meant to. He looked at her steadily. "Pearl," he said, and his voice was careful with it, like a man handling something that mattered. She picked up the plate and went inside. She lay awake for a long time that night listening to the sounds of the place, and she thought about the fact that in 3 days Abel Bishop had mended her fence, solved her drainage problem, restacked her fallen stones, and eaten every meal she had set in front of him without once pressing against any of the invisible walls she had built around herself since November. And she thought about the fact that tomorrow the work would be done, and he would have no reason to stay. The thought sat in the center of her chest like a stone in a creek, surprising her with its weight. The next morning she came out to the porch early and found him saddling his horse at the barn, which she had expected. His horse was a dun gelding with 1 white sock, and the horse turned its head and looked at her with mild dark eyes as she came across the yard. "The fence held overnight," she said. "I checked. It should hold for years," he said, without stopping his work with the cinch strap. She stood there with her coffee cup and said, "I'm going to Harlan's Creek today, to settle my account at the mercantile." She paused. "The road goes east from my gate. If you're heading east, you're welcome to ride along as far as town." He straightened and looked at her over the horse's back, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was perfectly balanced and perfectly still, like a scale waiting to settle. "I appreciate that," he said. They rode into Harlan's Creek side by side on the dry wagon track that ran between the cedar flats, close enough to talk but not so close as to cause talk, though Pearl was aware that arriving in any small town in Texas in 1878 with a man people didn't know was going to cause talk regardless of the distance between the horses. She found she minded this less than she would have expected. Harlan's Creek was not a large place. It had a mercantile, a blacksmith, a post office that operated out of the back of the mercantile, a saloon that pretended to be a hotel, a Methodist church, and perhaps 40 families scattered within a 10-mile radius who considered it their town in the way that frontier people claimed the nearest place with a store and a post office as their own. Pearl knew every one of those families, and every one of those families knew her and knew her situation. And when she rode in that morning with Abel Bishop beside her, she could feel the town paying attention in the quiet way that small places do. She went directly to the mercantile, and Abel went to the blacksmith to have the Dunn's right front shoe tightened, which the horse had needed since she'd noticed him limping slightly on the rocky ground of the south pasture yesterday afternoon. She had not mentioned the limping to him, but she had seen him check the shoe that morning before he saddled up, so he had noticed it himself. Walter Caldwell, who ran the mercantile, was a heavy-set man with a waxed mustache and the benign manner of a man who extended credit to struggling homesteaders, partly out of genuine goodwill, and partly because the interest was better than what he could get from the bank in Austin. He counted out Pearl's payment with the careful satisfaction of a man who appreciated a debt being settled, and when he was done he leaned on the counter and said, "Saw you come in with a stranger. He mended my south pasture fence," Pearl said. "3 sections that went down in January." "Is that right?" Walter said, in the particular tone of voice that meant he was filing the information away. "It is," Pearl said, and bought a sack of cornmeal, a pound of coffee, and a small tin of molasses, because she had money now and because she intended to eat well this spring. Abel was waiting outside the mercantile when she came out, the Dunn's shoe attended to, and he took the sack of cornmeal from her without being asked and tied it to his saddle without comment, and she let him do it because it was a practical thing and because the sack was heavier than it looked. They bought lunch from the woman who ran the lunch counter in the back of the saloon, which was a Mrs. Hetty Greer, who was 60 years old and afraid of nothing, and who set their plates down in front of them with the efficient authority of a woman who had been feeding cowboys and ranchers and the occasional traveling preacher for 30 years. Pearl had always liked Hetty Greer enormously. "You're Abel Bishop," Hetty said, pausing beside their table and looking at him with sharp, bright eyes. "I am," he said. "You drove cattle for Ray Prout last fall. My nephew was on that drive." "Tom Greer," Abel said, nodding. "Good hand." "He said the same about you," Hetty said, and went back to her counter with the satisfied air of someone who had confirmed something she needed to know. Pearl ate her stew and watched Abel process this exchange, and she thought about how strange and small the world of the Texas frontier was, how everyone was connected to everyone else through a chain of drives and ranches and trails that made the vast emptiness of the land seem paradoxically intimate. "You have a reputation," she said. "Tom Greer has a generous memory," Abel said. "Hetty Greer does not," Pearl said. He looked at her and something shifted in his expression, a slight softening that she was not sure he was aware of, and he looked down at his stew and ate, and she looked down at her own bowl and ate, and the lunch counter hummed with the quiet commerce of midday. On the way home she said, without looking at him, "There is a section of roof on my barn that I have been meaning to address since March. The shingles came loose in the January ice, and the water gets in when it rains, and I have 2 milk cows who would prefer to be dry." She could feel him looking at the side of her face. "I can do roof work," he said. "The pay would be the same," she said. $1.25 a day plus meals." "Yes," he said. "Just yes. Not yes ma'am or that sounds agreeable or any of the other cushioning words that men sometimes put around a simple answer. Just yes, clean and direct." And Pearl felt something in her chest ease open slightly, like a door in a room that had been shut for a long winter. "You'll need to go to the lumber yard in Mason for cedar shingles," she said. "That's 12 miles east. I can give you the money and you can take the wagon tomorrow if you're willing." "I'm willing," he said. He rode to Mason the next morning and came back in the early afternoon with the wagon loaded with cedar shingles and also with a new hinge for the barn door that she had not asked for and had not known was needed. And when she raised an eyebrow at the hinge, he said, "The left door was dragging on the dirt. I noticed it when I brought the horse in." She looked at the hinge and looked at him and said, "Put it on the account." "It cost 20 cents, he said. 20 cents, she agreed firmly and went inside. He spent 2 days on the barn roof, and during those 2 days Pearl went about her ordinary work with the knowledge of him overhead in a way that she was not going to think about too carefully. She could hear him moving along the roof slope, the sound of the hammer, the occasional measured pause of a man deciding what came next. She brought him water at mid-morning and at mid-afternoon, and set it on the fence rail below the ladder and went back to the garden or the kitchen, or whatever she had been doing. And each time she came back the cup was empty and set neatly on the rail again. On the evening of the first roof day, when she brought supper out, she sat in the porch chair as she usually did and said, while studying the west horizon where the sun was going down in shades of copper and rose, "Tell me about the place you had, in the hill country north of Fredericksburg." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was about 80 acres. Good spring on it, some bottomland for crops. I bought it in 1873 with everything I'd saved from 4 years of cattle work." A pause. "Lost it in 1876 when the note came due, and the bank in Fredericksburg had been bought by a land company out of New York that decided they didn't want to refinance small holders." Pearl turned her head and looked at him. "A land company. There were a lot of them coming in at that time," he said. "Still are. They buy up the bank notes and then they call them in all at once, and when the small holders can't pay in 60 days they take the land. It happened to 4 families in my valley the same season it happened to me." She thought about this for a long moment, about the particular cruelty of that kind of dispossession, which was not the dramatic violence of an outlaw raid or a storm or a fire, but the cold legal mechanism of distant money exerting itself on people who had nothing but the work of their hands and the sweat of their years to stand against it. It was a cruelty she had been fortunate enough to avoid only because Thomas had been careful about debt, and because Walter Caldwell was a local man with local loyalties, not a representative of Eastern capital. "That is deeply unjust," she said, and she meant it without qualification. "Yes," he said, "it is." He paused. "I went to a lawyer in Fredericksburg. He told me I was right and I had no legal recourse, and those two facts apparently can coexist without anyone being particularly troubled." Pearl shook her head slowly. "And then you went on the trail." "And then I went on the trail," he said. "It seemed like the cleanest thing. No walls, no papers, no notes due. Just the work and the sky and the cattle and the next town." "But you didn't want to do that forever," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and in the last red light of the sunset his face was very clear and very close, and she could see the tiredness in him that was not just physical, the kind of tiredness that came from a man who had stopped letting himself want a particular kind of life because the wanting had already hurt him once. "No," he said, "not forever." The barn roof was finished on the second day, and it was solid work, tight and square, and Pearl stood in the barn with the afternoon light coming through the window and no light coming through the shingles, which it had been, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a problem genuinely solved. She went out to the porch that evening with 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, something she had been deciding against, and then deciding for all afternoon. She handed one to Abel as he came up the porch steps, and he took it with both hands and looked down at it for a moment and then looked up at her and said, "Thank you, Pearl." And his voice did the thing it had done when he said her name the first time, careful and sure, like he was handling something breakable and valuable, and had made a decision to be worthy of the handling. She sat in her chair and he sat on the steps, and they drank coffee while the stars came out. And this time, there was no particular pretense of conversation for the sake of conversation. They talked about the garden and what she was hoping to get from it this summer, and he said his grandmother in Georgia had grown sweet corn and pole beans, and she asked what Georgia was like, and he said it was green and wet and full of red clay, and she had never been east of San Antonio and told him so, and he said San Antonio was a fine city as Texas cities went, and she said she preferred the country, and he said he did too. It was ordinary conversation. It was the most comfortable ordinary conversation Pearl had had in longer than she could easily remember, and when she went inside to bed, she lay awake again and thought about the fact that the roof was done, and the fence was done, and the drainage was done, and there was no particular reason for him to stay. She thought about reasons a person might have to stay. In the morning he was still there. She did not ask why, because she understood without asking that he was as aware as she was that the original work was finished, and that he was still here because neither of them had said the words that would have caused him to leave. And those words had not been said because neither of them wanted to say them. She found him examining the kitchen garden fence, which was a modest affair of wooden rails, and was not doing a particularly good job of keeping rabbits out, which she knew, and which she had been meaning to address and had not gotten to because there were always 17 other things. "I can make you a proper rabbit fence with wire," he said, when she came out with her coffee. "It doesn't have to be much, just a low wire skirt along the bottom of the rails." "And how much will that cost me?" she said. He tilted his head slightly. "Nothing. I have wire left over from the pasture fence. The wire would go to waste otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment over the rim of her coffee cup, and he looked back at her with those gray-green eyes that were, she had decided, the most honest eyes she had ever encountered in a human face, because they said exactly what they meant and nothing more and nothing less. And what they were saying now was something she was not quite ready to say back, but which she was no longer actively running away from. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He spent the morning on the rabbit fence and she spent the morning baking bread, and at noon she brought lunch out, and instead of setting it on the post, she sat down on the garden fence rail next to where he was working and handed him the plate and sat with her own. And they ate lunch in the garden with the smell of the sage and the first small tomatoes coming on and the bees moving through the wildflowers she let grow along the east side. "My husband planted the sage," she said. "Thomas. He said it kept the flies off." "Does it?" Abel asked. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but it smells good, so I've kept it up." He nodded, looking at the sage with an expression that was respectful in the way that a person who had once lost their own piece of ground could look at someone else's with genuine understanding of what it meant. "He died in November," she said. It was the first time she had said it to him directly, not as a circumstance revealed in passing but as a fact stated plainly. "A fever. It came on fast. He was sick for 9 days and then he was gone." "I'm sorry," Abel said. "He sounds like a man who cared about his ground." "He did," Pearl said. "He was a good man." She paused. "We were not a love match in the storybook sense. We were practical about it. I was 23 and he was 35, and we both wanted the same things: a piece of land, a working farm, a steady life, and we built it together. I respected him very much and I was fond of him, and I grieved him honestly." She looked at the sage. "But I am not going to be false about it and pretend that I am in some permanent state of mourning that makes me unable to look clearly at the life that is still going on around me." She was not sure why she said this. It felt like something that needed to be said, something that was both honest and perhaps also a door left slightly open, and she was going to let it sit there and be whatever it was. Abel ate the last bite of his biscuit and looked at the garden with that quiet, careful gaze and then said, "I think you are one of the most honest people I have ever encountered." "I think you are too," she said, and then she picked up her plate and went inside because there were things that needed to be said slowly. The rabbit fence was done by mid-afternoon, and it was a good, clean piece of work, properly tensioned, the wire skirt going into the ground an inch to discourage digging. Pearl walked around it and tested it with her hands and said, "This will hold," and he said, "Yes, it will." And they stood on opposite sides of the garden gate in the golden afternoon light and looked at each other with the particular awareness of two people who have moved past some threshold without either of them having made a formal announcement about it. That evening, she brought 2 plates out to the porch. She set one on the rail and held one in her hand, and she sat down in her chair and she started eating. And after a moment he sat on the steps and reached for the plate on the rail, and they ate supper together in the warm evening air. And at some point during the meal, his shoulder was against the porch post, and she was leaning slightly forward from her chair, and the distance between them was companionable rather than careful. And she thought that the changing of distances was one of the quietest and most significant things in the world. He said, "I'd like to stay on, if you have more work and are willing. I have a smokehouse that needs rechinking," she said. "And the well housing has a loose beam." "I can do those things," he said. "I know you can," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the stars were coming out enormous and close in the big Texas sky, and the nightjar was at its work in the cedar thicket, and somewhere to the south one of the cows made a long low sound of general contentment, and Pearl said, "Abel." "Pearl," he said, "why have you been sleeping in barns and under the sky for months without taking a meal at a table?" It was more direct than anything she had said before, and she watched him feel it, watched the consideration move through his face before he answered. "Because being inside four walls with a table set and a fire burning started to feel like something I'd lost the right to," he said. "After the land company, after Fredericksburg, it seemed like pretending to something I'd had and didn't have any more, and I'd rather sleep honest than sleep comfortable and mistaken." Pearl was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That is the saddest thing I have ever heard that was also entirely understandable." "Is it?" he said. "Yes," she said. "And I want you to know that the meal on the rail was not because I thought you needed to be kept at a distance. It was because I could see that you were somewhere that needed to be moved through gently, and I have been moved through gently myself enough times to know what that looks like." He looked at her, and his expression was something she had not seen on his face before, something that was not the usual careful steadiness but was instead something open and a little vulnerable and very real. And he said, "Pearl," again, just her name, but in a way that had more in it than a name usually contains. "Yes," she said. "I think I would very much like to have a reason to stay," he said. "I think you have one," she said, "if you're willing to look for it." The smokehouse chinking took 3 days, and the well housing beam took 1. And during those 4 days, something shifted between them in the particular way that things shift when two people have admitted to wanting something, and are now navigating the territory between wanting and having with the appropriate care of people who have both been hurt by moving too fast toward things that did not last. He began eating at the porch steps each evening with his plate set not on the rail but handed directly to him. And this small change was, in the context of everything it meant, a significant one. She sat in her chair and he sat on the steps, and they talked every evening until the stars were well up. And what they talked about ranged from the practical, the condition of her creek, the possibility of adding a third cow, whether the kitchen garden needed a second well drawing in a dry summer, to the personal, in the way that conversations between people who are becoming important to each other always drift toward the personal eventually. He told her about growing up in Georgia, the fifth of 7 children, his father a farmer and his mother a woman who read to all of them every evening from whatever books she could get her hands on. He had come west at 19 because Georgia after the war was a particular kind of grief and a particular kind of constraint, and the frontier had seemed like a place where a man could start clean. He had worked cattle and mines and timber and rail until he had saved enough for his hill country land, and the loss of that land had done something to him that he was only now beginning to understand the full shape of. Pearl told him about growing up in Missouri, one of 4 sisters, her father a Presbyterian minister who believed fiercely in female education, and who had made sure all 4 of his daughters could read and cipher and think clearly. She had married Thomas Doyle at 23 and followed him to Texas because he had seen the land and believed in it, and she had believed in his belief, which had turned out to be enough for 7 years of building and a good working life. She told Abel about the fever, about the 9 days, about the particular loneliness of the winter that followed, and she told it without false sentiment and without bitterness, which was how she had processed it, through the long discipline of practical necessity. On the 4th evening after the smokehouse work was done, when they were sitting in their usual positions on the porch and the coffee had been drunk and the conversation had reached one of its natural quiet places, Abel said, "Can I ask you something direct?" "You can always ask me something direct," Pearl said. "It's the indirect I have trouble with." "Do you want me to stay past the work?" he said. "Not as a hired hand. Past that. Do you want me to stay?" Pearl looked at the dark cedar hills and then looked at him and said, "Abel, I set a plate on that porch rail every evening not because I thought you needed to be managed, but because I wanted you to stay long enough for you to find your way back to yourself. And I've been watching you do it for 3 weeks now, and yes, I want you to stay past the work." He reached over and took her hand, which was resting on the arm of her chair, and he held it with the same careful, sure quality that he did everything. And she felt the warmth of it move up her arm and into her chest, and she looked down at his hand holding hers, and then up at his face, and he looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had seen too much frontier and too much loss, and were now here, in the lamplight spilling from her kitchen window, full of something that was the opposite of loss. "I haven't wanted to stay anywhere in 2 years," he said. "Not really wanted it, not the way I want it now." "I know," she said. "I can tell the difference." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to the back of it, the lightest possible pressure, and looked at her over her own hand and said, "I'm going to court you properly, if that's what you want." "That is what I want," she said. And so he did. Courting in the practical world of the Texas frontier in 1878 did not involve calling cards or parlor visits or the elaborate choreography of Eastern society. It involved a man showing up reliably, which Abel did. It involved a man making his intentions clear to the community, which Abel did by presenting himself at the Methodist Church in Harlan's Creek on the following Sunday with Pearl beside him, and letting the 40 families within the 10-mile radius draw their conclusions, which they did rapidly and with apparent satisfaction. It involved a man contributing to the household not just as a hired hand, but as someone who was there, who was present, who cared about the details of the place in the way that a person with a stake in it cares about the details. He moved out of the barn and into the house in the most formal possible sense, taking the spare room that Pearl cleared out, and which had previously been used to store seed corn, and he slept there, and Pearl slept in her own room, and there was a propriety to the arrangement that was both sincere and also, on the practical level, recognized by everyone as a temporary station on the way to somewhere else. He learned the place, really learned it, in the way that a man who had once had his own piece of ground learns a piece of ground, from the ground up. He mapped the seasonal changes in the spring output and noted where the summer grass was strong and where it tended to burn out. He tracked the position of the afternoon shade across the kitchen garden, and suggested moving the beans and squash to the north side, where they'd have a better chance in August. He fixed the kitchen window that had never quite shut right in Thomas's time, and he tightened every loose board on the porch steps, and he rebuilt the chicken coop with a wire roof to keep the hawks out, because Pearl had been losing hens to hawks since spring, and it had been a low-grade irritation for months. And every evening they sat on the porch together, sometimes talking and sometimes not, and the meals moved from the porch rail to the porch step to the small table she sometimes put out in front of the door on warm evenings. And one evening in late May, she set the table inside the kitchen, 2 places, with the good plates that she had been keeping in the cupboard since November, and she put food on it and lit the lamp and said, through the screen door, "Supper's ready, Abel." She heard him come up the steps. She heard him pull the screen door open. She heard his boots on the kitchen floor, that particular sound of boots on rough-cut wood flooring that is as specific and domestic a sound as any she knew. And she looked up from the stove, and he was standing inside the kitchen door in the lamplight, looking at the table set for 2 with an expression that did very particular things to her composure. He said nothing. He walked to the table and pulled out the chair across from hers and sat down and looked at the plate of food in front of him and then looked up at her. And his eyes were very clear and the lamplight was warm, and she sat down across from him and they ate supper inside under a roof, at a table with a lamp burning between them for the first time. He took a breath that was more than a breath and said, "I had forgotten what this felt like." "I know," she said. "It feels like something I'd like to keep feeling," he said. "Then keep it," she said. After supper, he helped her wash the dishes, which was not something she had asked for or expected, and they stood at the basin together with the warm, soapy water and the late evening air coming through the window, and he was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her, And when she handed him the last plate to dry, she let their hands overlap on the edge of it for a moment before releasing it. And he went very still and looked at her profile, and she looked up at him. And he said her name again in that voice that had always said more than a name, and then he kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, brief and deliberate, and full of the same careful quality as everything else he did. And when it ended, they looked at each other in the warm lamplight of her kitchen, and Pearl felt something rearrange itself in her chest into a shape she had not expected to find again. Something that was neither the practical affection she'd had for Thomas, nor the romantic fantasy she'd read about in her father's books, but something real and specific. Rooted in this particular person, and this particular place, and this particular life. "Pearl Doyle," he said, with the ghost of a smile that she had been watching work its way to the surface for weeks. "I think you are the best thing that has happened to me in a very long time." "Abel Bishop," she said, "I think the same is true." He proposed to her in the kitchen garden on a Saturday morning in June, standing between the sage and the pole beans with his hat in his hands and the sun bright on his face, and it was not a theatrical proposal. There was no speech. He simply said that he loved her and that he wanted to build this life with her properly if she would have him, and she said yes before he had quite finished the sentence, which caused him to laugh, a real laugh. The kind she had been hoping to hear since the first day, and which turned out to be just as warm and unguarded as she had imagined it would be. They were married in the Harlan's Creek Methodist Church on the second Saturday of July, 1878. The Reverend Simmons performed the ceremony with the brisk efficiency of a frontier minister who had more work than time, and Hetty Greer from the lunch counter sat in the front pew with her nephew Tom, and cried in the satisfied way of someone who has been hoping for an outcome and seen it arrive. Walter Caldwell was there with his wife, and most of the 40 families within the 10-mile radius were there, because in a small community, a wedding is one of the genuinely good things that gives everyone something to feel well about. Pearl wore the best dress she had, a deep blue cotton with white buttons at the collar that she had been saving for occasions, and she carried a handful of the wildflowers from the east side of the garden, the ones she let grow along the fence. Abel wore a clean shirt and his best coat, and had gotten his hair cut in Mason the previous Thursday, and he stood at the front of the church with his hands still, and his eyes on the door waiting for her to come through it. And when she did, and their eyes met across the small whitewashed church, his face did that open, unguarded thing again that she had learned to watch for, and she felt it in the center of her chest like the sound of a bell. The summer was the happiest summer Pearl could remember. She had not known she was lonely, not truly, not in the way that you can see loneliness when it goes away, and the space it occupied becomes apparent in its absence. But it went away that summer, and the space it had occupied was filled instead with the ordinary, extraordinary richness of a life that had another person genuinely in it. Abel, who had been sleeping under open sky and eating from trail cookfires and moving from place to place for 2 years, was discovering what it meant to have a home again, and he threw himself into the rediscovery with the full intensity of someone who had been a long time without it. They expanded the kitchen garden in late July, adding a whole new bed of sweet corn on Abel's grandmother's model, and he was right about the Georgia corn because it came up strong and sweet, and they ate it boiled and then roasted over the fire, and Abel said it was almost exactly as he remembered, and she said it was the best corn she had ever eaten, which was true. He acquired a second horse in August, a chestnut mare that he traded for with 3 days of fence mending work on the Harlan's Creek community range, and the mare turned out to be exceptionally good-tempered and fit the farm well, and Pearl learned to ride her with the kind of competence that came from growing up in Missouri and knowing horses, even if she had not ridden much since coming to Texas. In September, he built a second room onto the back of the house. He did not ask her about it as a project exactly. He simply said one morning over breakfast that he'd been thinking about it, and she said she had been thinking about it too, and by the time they'd had their second cup of coffee, they had talked through the design and the materials, and he started laying the foundation that afternoon. She did not ask him why he had thought about it. They both understood why. The understanding sat between them with the comfortable warmth of a fire that has been properly built and is burning well, and neither of them needed to put it in more words than they already had. The fall was rich and harvested and full of the particular golden light that Texas falls have when the summer heat has finally released its grip, and the sky turns a cleaner, deeper blue, and the cedar takes on a bronze undertone in the morning and evening light. Pearl put up preserves and dried beans and smoked a side of pork from a hog they had bought from a neighbor, and the pantry filled up in the way that a properly managed farm's pantry fills up in the fall, with the reassurance of abundance laid down against the winter. Abel fixed the chimney on the kitchen stove in October, discovering a crack in the flue that had been letting smoke into the house in ways she had attributed to the wind direction, and had not investigated further. He fixed it with the methodical thoroughness that was so characteristic of him, and then stood back and said, "That should have been done 2 years ago." And she said, "It was done the moment it needed to be," because that was how she thought about time, and he looked at her with that quality in his eyes that she had come to know as love, though it was not a sentimental look but a solid one, as if he were confirming something he was already certain of. Pearl was expecting their first child by November, which she had known since September and which she told Abel on a Sunday morning when he came in from the barn with the milk, setting the pail on the kitchen table and looking at her face and going very still. "November," she said, meaning the baby would come in late spring the following year. He set the milk pail down on the table and looked at her, and she looked at him, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her in the careful, sure way he held everything that mattered to him, and she felt his heart against her ear, and it was beating hard, and she put her hand against his chest and felt it and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said, into her hair, and then said it again, "Yes," and his voice was full and warm and certain, and she understood that what was happening inside him in that moment was something very large and very good, the kind of large and good thing that is made possible only when you have been through enough loss to understand the full weight of what you're being given. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was colder than the previous winter, but Pearl did not notice the cold in the same way. The house held heat better with the chimney repaired and the new back room added, and the barn was tight after Abel's work, and the pantry was full, and every evening they sat by the kitchen stove with the lamp burning, and she mended or read while he worked on whatever small piece of harness or equipment needed attention, and the fire went all night, and the coyotes called from the hills, and the world outside was cold and dark and perfectly at bay. He read to her sometimes, borrowing books from the small lending library that the Methodist Church had started with donations from the congregation, and he was a good reader, clear and considered, and she liked listening to his voice read words that other people had thought carefully enough to write down. She read to him sometimes too, and they were the best evenings, when the wind was up outside and the house was warm, and the reading moved between them like a conversation, one voice and then the other, passing the book back and forth. Christmas came, and they made it with a tree cut from the cedar thicket, and whatever small ornaments Pearl had in the trunk that had come with her from Missouri, glass beads and a few tin stars, and a paper angel that had survived 2 moves and a frontier winter. Abel carved a set of small wooden figures, a nativity in the Georgia style his mother had always kept, working at it over several November evenings by lamplight, and Pearl set them on the mantelpiece among the glass beads, and thought that the particular combination of Missouri glass beads and Georgia carved wood on a Texas hill country mantelpiece was exactly right, was in fact a picture of what they were. Spring came early in 1879, with the bluebonnets coming up along the fence lines and the creek running clear after a good wet February, and Pearl's garden went in with twice the area it had had the year before, and the corn Abel planted in the new south field took hold in the warming earth and began its long upward reach toward the Texas sun. Their son was born in May, a strong, healthy boy who announced himself to the world with a vigor that the attending midwife, Mrs. Clara Finch from Harlan's Creek, said was a very good sign. Abel was outside on the porch during the birth, which was the custom, and Pearl could hear him pacing the boards with a rhythmic steadiness that was both endearing and absolutely characteristic of him, because even his anxiety was measured and disciplined. When Mrs. Finch opened the door and said, "You have a fine son, Mr. Bishop," Pearl heard the pacing stop. He came in quietly and stood beside the bed and looked at the baby and then at Pearl with an expression that transcended anything she had adequate words for. So she simply held the baby out to him, and he took his son with the same careful, sure hands he brought to everything, and held him against his chest and looked down at him with absolute attention. "Thomas," Pearl said, "if that's all right with you, Thomas Abel Bishop." He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet, and he nodded, just nodded, and she reached up and touched his face, and he turned his mouth against her palm the way she knew he would, and they stayed like that for a long moment, the three of them in the warm afternoon light of the bedroom with the sound of the spring wind in the cedar outside, and the creek running in the low ground, and the whole long good life of the place going on around them. Thomas Abel Bishop grew up on the 40 acres of the Doyle homestead, which was registered as the Bishop homestead at the county land office in the fall of 1879, when Abel was able to purchase the adjacent 20 acres to the south from a departing homesteader, making the place 60 acres of good hill country ground with a reliable spring and a south field and a kitchen garden that produced prodigiously every summer. The boy had his father's gray-green eyes and his mother's directness, and from the time he could walk, he was underfoot in the barn and the garden and the south field with the cheerful persistence of a child who is entirely at home in the world. Pearl resumed her full work on the place within 6 weeks of the birth, which was slightly early by the standards of the time, but was by her own assessment entirely sensible, and she and Abel developed the easy, productive partnership that they had been building toward since that first afternoon on the fence line, where each knew their own domain and respected the others, and the whole was considerably stronger than either of its parts. She took on some additional work in 1880, teaching reading to 3 of the younger children of neighboring families who had no access to the school in Mason, teaching them on Saturday mornings at the kitchen table, which was a practice her father, the Presbyterian minister, would have approved of entirely. Abel took on a small amount of custom fence work for neighboring ranches during the quieter winter months, which added steadily to the savings they were building toward the purchase of a 4th cow, and eventually a small herd of beef cattle, in addition to the dairy operation. They had been married 3 years, and Thomas was 2.5 years old, and pulling himself up to the porch rail to look at the road with his father's careful attention to the horizon when Pearl told Abel about the second baby. He was sitting on the porch steps in the September evening, the first cool evening of the fall, and she came out and sat in her chair and said it plainly, as she said everything, and he turned and looked at her, and then smiled, not the occasional ghost of a smile that had taken weeks to surface, but the full, warm, open smile that she had been privileged to see regularly now for more than 3 years, and which still had exactly the effect on her that it had had the first time. "When?" he said. "March," she said. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of her chair, the same way he had taken it the first time, and held it with the same sure and careful quality, and she leaned her head back against the chair and looked at the September stars and thought about the particular grace of a life that had circled around and given her back things she had believed were gone. The second child was a daughter, born in March of 1881, and they named her Clara Me Bishop, Clara for Mrs. Finch, who had attended both births and who had by this time become a genuine friend of the family, and Me because Pearl had always liked the sound of it. Clara came into the world with her mother's determination and her father's stillness, a combination that by the time she was walking suggested she would be an interesting person to know, and she was. The spring of 1881 was the spring that Thomas, now almost 3, started following Abel around the farm with a focused devotion that made both of his parents look at each other over the top of his head, with the private mutual amusement of parents who recognize their child in someone they love. Abel carried Thomas on his shoulders when he walked the fence line in the mornings and taught him the names of the native grasses and how to read the weather in the clouds and what direction the spring would rise from based on which side of the hill was wet. And Thomas absorbed it all with the solemn concentration of a small person who knows he is being given something important. One Saturday afternoon in April of 1881, a man arrived at their gate who turned out to be one of the 4 families who had lost their hill country land north of Fredericksburg to the same New York land company that had taken Abel's place. The man's name was Ernst Bauer, a German Texan who had farmed the valley for 12 years before the company had moved on him, and he had tracked Abel down through the word-of-mouth network of the Texas frontier to say that a lawyer in Austin had taken up the case against the land company's methods, and that there were enough affected families willing to testify that there was a real possibility of legal action. Pearl set out coffee and bread and butter and sat at the table while the 2 men talked, because this was her kitchen and her home, and she was part of whatever decision was going to be made about it. Ernst Bauer was a solid, careful man in his mid-40s who had the respectful manner of someone who understood that he was asking something significant and knew it. "I don't want money from the land company," Abel said, after hearing everything Ernst had to say. "Even if the lawyer wins, I don't want the old place back either. It's done." He glanced at Pearl and she nodded almost imperceptibly because she understood exactly what he meant and she agreed with it. "But I'll testify about what happened and what it cost. Because what they did to 4 families in that valley was wrong and it should be on the record. And if it helps the lawyer build a case that stops them from doing it to the next 40 families somewhere else, then I'll spend the time it takes to go to Austin and say my piece in front of a court." Ernst Bauer looked at him steadily and said, "That is exactly what I was hoping to hear." "Pearl will need to come with me," Abel said. "I won't leave her here alone with 2 young children for however long it takes." Pearl looked at him. "I can manage. I know you can manage," he said, "but I'm not going to ask you to." She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "All right. We'll all go to Austin." They went to Austin in May, a 4-day wagon trip, with Thomas delighted by every mile of the journey, and Clara swaddled and remarkably serene, and Abel driving the team with the same steady competence he brought to every physical task, and Pearl sitting beside him on the wagon bench watching Texas roll past in its enormous, various beauty and thinking that whatever she had thought her life was going to be, it had turned out to be something considerably larger and more interesting than the original plan. The lawyer in Austin was a young man named James Tully, who had the intensity of someone who believed genuinely in what he was doing, which Pearl found reassuring in a lawyer. The testimony took 2 days, Abel giving his account clearly and directly, and without exaggeration, Ernst Bauer and 2 other families giving theirs, and James Tully presenting the pattern of the land company's behavior to the court with the kind of disciplined legal argument that builds its case brick by brick. The judge was a district court judge named Morrison, who had a reputation for being slow and thorough and fair, which combination was apparently rare enough that people remarked on it. The ruling came 3 months later, by mail, forwarded through Walter Caldwell's post office. The land company was found to have engaged in fraudulent foreclosure practices in at least 8 cases across 3 counties, and was ordered to pay damages to the affected landowners. It was not a complete vindication. The land was not returned and the damages were modest, but James Tully's letter that accompanied the court document said that the ruling had established a legal precedent that would make the same pattern of behavior considerably harder for land companies to employ going forward, and that was, in his judgment, the more important thing. Abel read the letter at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, while Pearl nursed Clara and Thomas sat on the floor with the wooden nativity figures Abel had carved 2 years ago, arranging and rearranging them in elaborate configurations that only he understood. When Abel finished the letter, he set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. "4 more families won't lose their ground because of what we did," he said. "Probably more than 4, Pearl said. "Probably," he said. He folded the letter and put it in the box where they kept important papers, beside their marriage certificate and the land registration papers for the Bishop homestead. And he came and sat beside her at the table and looked at their daughter nursing and their son on the floor and the kitchen full of lamplight and the window full of stars. And he said nothing, which was exactly right. The years that followed were years of building. The beef cattle came in 1882. A modest start of 10 head that they grazed on the south pasture and the leased community range. And the herd grew steadily under Abel's management to 40 head by 1884, which was enough to provide a meaningful income in addition to the dairy operation, and made the Bishop farm one of the more productive small holdings in the Harlan's Creek community. The kitchen garden expanded year by year as Pearl refined what worked and what didn't in their particular combination of soil and rainfall and light, and she began selling preserves and dried herbs to the mercantile in town, which was a modest additional income, and which gave her a satisfaction that was distinct from the farm work, the satisfaction of making something fine and having other people recognize it. Thomas started school in Mason in 1883 when he was 4, riding there and back with a group of neighboring farm children who made the journey together, and he took to learning with the same steady enthusiasm he brought to everything, coming home with his slate full of arithmetic and spelling, and his pockets full of the small interesting objects: a perfect quartz pebble, a shed snake skin, a jay feather, that a child who pays attention to the world inevitably accumulates. Clara, 18 months younger, watched her brother's school days with a focused impatience that made Pearl certain she would be reading before she started school, and she was right. Pearl taught Clara to read herself, at the kitchen table on winter evenings, using the same method her father had used, starting with the Bible and moving to whatever books they had been able to acquire. And Clara absorbed it with a speed and hunger that her father's mother back in Georgia would, Pearl thought, have recognized and appreciated. In the fall of 1883, Pearl discovered she was expecting again, and told Abel on a Sunday afternoon while they were walking the south fence line together, the two of them having developed the habit of walking the fence together on Sunday afternoons as a kind of combination inspection and unhurried conversation, one of the rituals of their life that had grown up organically, and that both of them valued precisely because it was theirs. He stopped walking and looked at her and said, "When?" And she said, "April." And he looked at the limestone hills to the west with an expression of such uncomplicated happiness that she felt it move through her like warm water. "3 children," he said. "We have the room," she said. "We do," he said, thinking of the back room he'd added and the small room beyond that which they'd added in 1881 and which Thomas had occupied since then. "Abel," she said. He looked at her. They were standing in the south pasture, with the good fence line running straight and tight on either side of them, and the drained corner dry and solid, and the herd moving on the far side, and the house visible on the rise to the north. White clapboard with the porch running the full width of the front, the porch where they had spent so many evenings building toward the life they now had. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am happier than I thought I would ever be again, not because the difficulty is gone, because it is not, but because you are here and we are building this together, and it is real and it is ours." He looked at her for a long, steady moment, and then he said, "When I was standing at your fence post that first day, I was about 2 weeks from deciding that the kind of life I actually wanted was something I was not going to have. I had almost made my peace with it. And then I asked if you were lost or just resting your eyes on the scenery," she said. "And then you did that," he said, and the smile was full and warm and certain, and she loved him with the particular depth and specificity that comes from having chosen the same person over and over again, in all the small daily ways that love is really made of. He took her hand and they stood in the south pasture for a moment longer, looking at the house and the hills and the clean line of the fence, and then they walked home together through the cedar and the wild flowers and the long amber light of the Texas fall afternoon. The third child was a boy, born in April of 1884, and they named him Daniel James Bishop, James for the Austin lawyer who had done a real service in the world. Daniel was from the beginning a different proposition from his siblings, louder and more immediately expressive, full of enthusiasms that changed direction rapidly and with great conviction. And by the time he was a year old, it was clear that the Bishop household had added a new energy to its existing character, and that everyone was going to have to adjust accordingly, which they did with the good humor of a family that had enough room and enough love to accommodate a new personality in full. By 1885, the Bishop homestead was 60 acres of productive hill country ground with a herd of 50 beef cattle, 3 dairy cows, a thriving kitchen garden, a tight and well-maintained set of buildings, and a household of 5. Thomas was 6 and serious and could already ride his own horse along the fence line. Clara was 4 and could read, and was currently working through a history of ancient Rome that Pearl had acquired from the lending library, and which Clara found compelling in the matter-of-fact way that she found most things compelling. Daniel was one and into everything and completely irresistible about it. Pearl taught her reading lessons at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings, with a rolling cast of 6 to 8 neighborhood children at any given time, and she had developed a genuine skill for it that was recognized by the community as a significant local good. The Reverend Simmons, who had married them and who was deeply invested in the expansion of the Methodist Sunday school, asked her twice if she would take on more formal teaching duties when the district managed to open a proper school, and she told him she would think about it, which meant yes, but not until Daniel was older. Abel was 37 in 1885, and Pearl was 35, and they had been married 7 years. And the man who had stood at her gate that spring morning in 1878, lean and weathered and carrying everything he owned, who had eaten months of meals beside campfires and under open sky, because being inside 4 walls at a table felt like something he'd lost the right to. That man had become someone she knew so thoroughly and loved so completely that it was sometimes startling to her to remember that there had been a time when she did not know him at all. He had found his way back to 4 walls and a fire and a table set with 2 plates, and more than that, he had built the 4 walls himself, rechinked the smokehouse and tight-roofed the barn and extended the house to hold their growing family. And the table now had 5 places and was set every evening with the everyday plates that Pearl had bought from Caldwell's Mercantile, because they were practical, not the good plates that she brought out on Sundays and at Christmas. And the fire in the kitchen stove burned reliably because the chimney was properly mended and had been for 7 years. And the lamp on the table burned every evening with the warm, steady, particular light of a home. On a Thursday evening in September of 1885, Pearl brought supper to the table and called the children in, and Abel came in from the barn where he had been checking on a cow with a swollen hoof, washing his hands at the basin outside before he came in, and he took his place at the table, and Thomas sat to his left, and Clara sat to his right, and Daniel was in the high chair at the end that Abel had made from cedar planks in the winter of 1884. And Pearl sat across from Abel with the lamp between them, and she passed the bread, and he passed the beans, and Daniel got his supper in the deliberate installments that a 1-year-old requires, and Thomas told a story about something that had happened at school that day involving a red-tailed hawk landing on the schoolhouse roof, which Clara examined for logical inconsistencies, and which Abel listened to with his full and patient attention. Pearl sat at her place and looked at the table and the faces at it, and the lamp burning and the window full of the dark Texas sky, and the warm air coming through with the smell of cedar, and the sound of the creek below the south pasture. And she thought about a woman standing at a fence post asking a stranger if he was lost. And she thought about a plate set on a porch rail without a word said. And she thought about how the smallest acts of quiet decency can be the hinge on which an entire life turns. And she thought that she would not change a single thing. Abel looked up from the bread he was cutting and caught her looking at him, and he held her gaze for a moment across the lamplight, and the table full of children and the ordinary beautiful chaos of the supper hour, and he looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had been careful and then open and then sure and were now, 7 years on, simply home. "All right," he said quietly. "Very all right," she said. And it was, and it continued to be. The children grew and the farm grew, and the years moved in their seasons, and Pearl and Abel Bishop of the hill country of Texas, 60 acres and a good spring and a tight fence line, built the kind of life that does not make for dramatic history, but makes for something considerably more durable. A life in which two people who had each survived their own particular losses chose each other, steadily and every day, and found in that choosing everything they had needed and more than they had dared to want. Thomas grew into a young man of 17 who could work a fence line, drive cattle, and argue thoughtfully about agricultural methods with men twice his age, and who had his father's patience and his mother's directness in equal measure. Clara was 15, and had by that point read everything the lending library and 2 neighboring family collections had to offer, and had composed a letter to a teacher training college in San Antonio about their program requirements, which letter Pearl had helped her refine, but which had been Clara's idea entirely. Daniel was 11 and still loud and still enthusiastic and still changing direction rapidly, currently passionate about horses with the kind of focused intensity that suggested it was not going to be a passing phase. On the last evening of the year, when the decade was turning and the stars over the hill country were their usual extravagance, and the family had eaten supper together, and the children had gone to bed, and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, Pearl and Abel sat on the porch together in the cool December dark, his arm around her shoulders and her head against his shoulder, looking at the lights of Harlan's Creek faint in the valley to the east and the bigger darkness of the hills to the west. "I was thinking today," Pearl said, "about the rabbit fence you made, with the wire left over from the pasture." "That's still holding," he said. "It is," she said. "I checked it last week." A pause. "I was thinking about how that was the moment I was sure." "Of what?" he said. "Of you," she said. "You could have charged me for the wire. It wasn't much, but it was something. And instead you said it would go to waste otherwise, which was technically true but was also not the whole truth." He was quiet for a moment in the way he still had, that same quality of considered silence that had been the first thing she had respected about him. Then he said, "The whole truth was that I wanted to do something for you that was not about the contract." "I know," she said. "That's how I knew." He tightened his arm around her, and she felt the warmth of him along her side and looked up at the stars that she had been looking at from this porch for more than 7 years. The same stars in the same enormous Texas sky, everything the same and everything different from that first evening when she had set a plate on the porch rail and walked back inside and listened to the sound of a man eating supper on her steps in the spring dark. "Abel," she said. "Pearl," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." "Thank you," he said, "for making it worth staying for." The porch boards were solid under their feet, the boards he had repaired and relaid and maintained for 7 years of seasons. The cedar in the thicket was the same cedar. The nightjar was making its call somewhere in the dark. The stars were going on forever in all directions above the hill country of Texas, where two people who had each been through the particular silence of loss had found their way to the particular fullness of a life built together, board by board, fence post by fence post, plate by plate, evening by evening, word by word, until the whole of it was something that would stand. And it stood. And the new year came in cold and clear over the hills, and the lamp in the kitchen window burned, and the house held its warmth against the dark. And inside it slept 3 children who were the work and the reward and the continuation of everything their parents had chosen for each other. And on the porch Pearl and Abel Bishop sat together in the last hour of the old year, and watched the stars move in their ancient, reliable courses. And neither one of them said anything more because there was nothing more that needed saying. They had made something whole, and it was whole and it was theirs and it was very good.